Daniel thought moving into Willow Creek with his wife was the start of a perfect life, but when HOA President Karen Miller set her sights on him, perfection turned into a nightmare. What began with a single letter about a backyard shed spiraled into a shocking lawsuit demanding his entire property. This is the story of how one homeowner uncovered the dark secrets of a neighborhood run by fear, and how an HOA Karen nearly stole everything. When Daniel and his wife first set eyes on Willow Creek, they thought they had stumbled upon the kind of neighborhood people only dreamed about. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, and every lawn seemed as if it had been manicured by the same invisible hand. The houses, though nearly identical in design, each had a subtle charm of their own. Porches adorned with seasonal decorations, flower beds bursting with color, and driveways that gleamed as if freshly cleaned every day. Children played freely. Without their parents worrying, dogs were walked on leashes along the sidewalks, and neighbors smiled at one another in passing. It was the kind of place that felt safe, orderly, and worth the price they had paid to live there. For Daniel, who had grown up in a noisy city where neighbors barely spoke to each other, it seemed like the start of a new life. But woven into the neatness of Willow Creek was an invisible structure that governed nearly everything: the homeowners association. At first, Daniel didn't pay much attention to it. The glossy welcome packet they received on move-in day looked harmless, a thick booklet filled with rules about paint colors, mailbox styles, and even acceptable types of holiday lights. It all seemed excessive, but Daniel assumed it was just bureaucracy designed to keep the neighborhood tidy. He and his wife laughed about it, tossing the packet in a drawer and thinking they would never need to look at it again. Not long after moving in, Daniel began noticing a woman walking the neighborhood with a clipboard. She was hard to miss, dressed in bright blouses and oversized sunglasses, with a stern expression that rarely softened. She would pause in front of houses, scribble notes, and sometimes take photos with her phone. Neighbors whispered her name: Karen Miller, the HOA president. She was said to be the one who made sure every blade of grass stayed within regulation height, every trash can was pulled in at the correct hour, and every car was parked in the proper space. Some people admired her for keeping standards high. Others avoided her entirely, knowing her reputation for handing out violation notices over the smallest things. At first, Karen barely noticed Daniel. He and his wife kept their property clean, their lawn neatly trimmed, and their home within the approved paint shades. But Daniel's backyard had something that would soon catch her attention: a shed. It wasn't new. In fact, the shed had been there since before Daniel even bought the house. It matched the style of the property and had been installed by the original builder with approval. To Daniel, it was a harmless structure, a place to keep gardening tools and storage boxes. To Karen, it was apparently an eyesore. One morning, Daniel opened his mailbox to find an official-looking envelope marked with the HOA's logo. Inside was a letter stating that his shed was non-compliant with community standards and needed to be removed immediately. The words were cold and bureaucratic, citing rules he had never heard of. He thought it must be a mistake, a clerical error, perhaps even a letter meant for someone else. But the warning was clear: failure to comply could result in fines. Daniel laughed it off, shaking his head as he placed the letter on the kitchen counter. Surely, something this absurd would blow over on its own. But as the days passed, Daniel noticed Karen pausing longer in front of his property. Sometimes she would tilt her head, studying the backyard from the street as if planning her next move. The once idyllic neighborhood began to feel different. The smiles of neighbors seemed forced, their small talk brief. Daniel began to realize that the perfection of Willow Creek came with a hidden price: control. Every flower planted, every decoration hung, and every item visible from the street could be judged, documented, and punished. His shed, something he had never questioned, had now placed a target on his back. The illusion of a perfect neighborhood began to crack. What Daniel thought was a harmless oversight was only the beginning of something much larger, something he could not yet see. What seemed like a simple letter was the opening move in a battle that would threaten not just his peace of mind, but his home itself. Daniel's initial dismissal of the shed violation turned out to be a mistake he would soon regret. Within a week, Another letter arrived, this time worded more aggressively. It claimed he was now officially out of compliance and would be fined $50 for every day the shed remained standing. The document looked carefully constructed, filled with legal terms and bolded warnings. Daniel skimmed through it in disbelief, muttering to himself that the shed had been there long before his family even purchased the home. Surely the HOA could not just invent new rules to apply retroactively. But the fines began to add up, each notice reminding him that the association was watching, calculating, and waiting for him to make a move to T first. Daniel considered simply tearing the shed down to avoid conflict, but something about the situation gnawed at him. The shed had been inspected during the purchase of the home. It was listed in the real estate disclosures. It had never been flagged as an issue before. Why now? And why with such intensity? His curiosity turned to unease as the frequency of the letters increased. Some included photographs of his backyard, clearly taken without his permission, showing the shed circled in red ink. It felt invasive, as if his privacy was slowly being stripped away by a force he hadn't agreed to. His wife urged him not to worry, but the neighborhood itself seemed to shift under the weight of Karen's presence. Daniel began noticing other homeowners receiving similar envelopes. A neighbor down the street had been fined for a basketball hoop that wasn't properly stored, another for leaving a car parked overnight in a driveway. Each family seemed frustrated but powerless, resigned to paying the fines rather than resisting. Karen had created an atmosphere where challenging the HOA felt dangerous, a kind of silent warning that fighting back would only make things worse. Then came the notice that changed everything. Instead of a fine, this letter carried an ultimatum. It demanded that Daniel not only remove the shed but also pay several $1,000s in accumulated penalties. The number seemed absurd, almost random, yet the letter stated that failure to comply could result in further legal action. It was no longer about the shed, it was about power. Daniel could feel it in the tone of the words, in the threatening weight of the paper in his hands. The following week, Karen made her intentions public. At a community meeting, she announced that Daniel's property was now in violation of serious community standards and that the HOA had authorized legal proceedings against him. He wasn't present at that meeting, but word spread quickly, through whispered conversations and cautious messages from neighbors. When Daniel finally confirmed the truth, it felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. The idea that his neighborhood, the place he had believed was safe and welcoming, was now actively preparing to take him to court was almost impossible to comprehend. Daniel tried contacting the HOA board, only to find his emails ignored and his calls redirected. It became clear that Karen controlled more than just the streets and lawns. She controlled the flow of information itself. Neighbors avoided his gaze when he walked by, as though associating with him might put them at risk. The atmosphere was no longer friendly or inviting. It was tense, quiet, and laced with fear. The final blow of the chapter came one morning when Daniel opened his front door to find an official notice taped to the glass. This was not the usual envelope slipped into his mailbox. It bore the stamp of a court filing. The HOA had filed a lawsuit against him, claiming persistent noncompliance and damages to the neighborhood's property values. The language was harsh and uncompromising, and for the first time, Daniel realized the depth of the battle ahead. It wasn't about rules, or even about fines. The HOA wasn't just asking him to remove the shed, they were setting the stage to take something far greater from him. The lawsuit papers sat heavy in Daniel's hands, their language sharp and unyielding. He read through them again and again, hoping he had misunderstood, but the words never softened. The HOA wasn't just asking for money, they were demanding that his property rights be stripped away. According to the documents, Daniel's continued refusal to remove the shed and pay fines had triggered a forfeiture clause. The claim stated that he had effectively surrendered ownership of his home to the association. It sounded absurd, like something out of a bad movie, but the documents carried official seals and signatures that made them difficult to dismiss. For the first time, Daniel began to feel the full weight of what he was up against. He tried to convince himself this was a bluff, a scare tactic designed to force him into compliance. Yet as he researched the HOA's bylaws, he found something. Chilling. Hidden deep in the fine print were new amendments labeled as emergency provisions, giving the association sweeping powers to seize properties in what they defined as extreme cases of violation. Daniel had never seen these clauses before, and neither had his neighbors. The amendments had been passed quietly at a board meeting that few homeowners had attended. With Karen in control of the board, the vote had gone through without resistance. It became clear that she had engineered these rules not for order, but for control. The lawsuit papers also included a breakdown of fines and fees, the numbers stacked so high they seemed impossible. Every day the shed remained, the charges compounded. Administrative costs, legal fees, and loss of neighborhood value were added in, inflating the debt to a figure that no average homeowner could possibly afford. Daniel realized the strategy was simple: crush him financially until surrender seemed like the only option. But there was something else woven into the documents that disturbed him even more. The HOA wasn't just after compliance. They wanted the deed to his house. It was then Daniel began connecting the dots. Over the past year, several houses in Willow Creek had gone up for sale under suspicious circumstances. Families that once seemed settled had suddenly vanished, their homes sold at HOA-organized auctions for prices far below market value. Rumors had floated around, but most people chalked it up to personal problems or bad financial luck. Now, staring at the lawsuit in his hands, Daniel understood that those families might not have left voluntarily. They had been forced out, their properties stripped away under the same rules now being used against him. The fear grew heavier when he considered how isolated he had become. His neighbors, once cheerful and chatty, avoided him altogether. It wasn't just politeness or business, it was fear. They had seen what happened to others who stood against Karen, and they wanted no part of it. Even those who sympathized with him whispered quietly, refusing to leave any record of their support. The community wasn't united, it was fractured, subdued under the weight of the HOA's authority. Day as the court date loomed, Daniel tried to prepare himself. He gathered old paperwork showing the shed had been approved, copies of his property, purchase documents, and photographs taken years before. But as thorough as he was, the fear persisted that Karen's influence might extend further than he realized. She wasn't just the head of the HOA, she seemed to have cultivated power. Through legal channels, connections, and sheer intimidation. The idea of standing in court against her felt less like seeking justice and more like walking into a trap to night. Daniel found himself unable to sleep, replaying every decision in his mind. He wondered if he should have taken the first letter. More seriously, if removing the shed early on might have avoided all of this. But then another thought crept in. If it hadn't been the shed, it would have been something else. Karen needed targets, and she had chosen him. The lawsuit was not about a structure in his backyard. It was about breaking him, making an example of him so no one else dared to resist. By the time the first hearing notice arrived, Daniel understood the stakes. He wasn't just fighting over a shed or a set of fines. He was fighting for his home, his financial security, and even his dignity. As a homeowner, the HOA had escalated far beyond simple neighborhood disputes, and if they succeeded, they would strip away more than just property. They would strip away the illusion that Willow Creek was a community at all. It was no longer a neighborhood. It was a battlefield, and Karen had just made her most aggressive move. Daniel knew that going into court blind would be a disaster. The lawsuit had been crafted with precision, and every detail of it suggested that Karen had played this game before. If he wanted any chance of fighting back, he needed to understand how far her influence reached and whether this kind of abuse had happened before. So he began digging. What started as a desperate attempt to clear his name quickly turned into an investigation that revealed just how carefully Karen had built her empire. The first step was combing through public records. Daniel spent hours at the county clerk's office, searching property transfers linked to Willow Creek. What he found shocked him. Over the last 5 years, nearly a dozen houses in the neighborhood had changed hands under unusual circumstances. Each transfer was tied to an HOA foreclosure, the result of unpaid fines or supposed violations. On paper, it looked routine. But when Daniel compared the sale prices to the market value, the numbers didn't add up. Homes that should have sold for $300,000 had been auctioned for less than half. Many of those homes ended up in the possession of the same handful of buyers, investors who appeared to be connected to Karen through family ties and business partnerships. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. Karen had turned the HOA into a machine for property acquisition, weaponizing the bylaws and fines to push homeowners out. Once they fell behind or grew too exhausted to fight, the association would swoop in, claim the property, and sell it off to her circle. Daniel realized he wasn't just up against a strict neighborhood enforcer, he was standing in the way of a profitable racket that had already ruined multiple families. His suspicions grew stronger when he reached out quietly to a family who had left Willow Creek 2 years earlier. They had moved to a nearby town and seemed reluctant to talk at first, but eventually shared their experience. Their story mirrored his own. Small violations escalated into overwhelming fines, followed by threats of legal action. They too had been sued, and though they tried to fight, the mounting costs drained them. They walked away from their home, unable to keep up with the pressure. Within months, Karen's associates had purchased the property at a fraction of its value. Hearing this, Daniel felt both validated and horrified. He wasn't alone, but that meant the danger was even more real than he had imagined. The deeper he dug, the darker the picture became. Financial records showed the HOA's budget was bloated with administrative expenses that didn't make sense. Tens of thousands of dollars were marked for legal fees each year, yet very little went toward community improvements. Meanwhile, Karen had recently purchased a vacation home in another state, along with a luxury car. Daniel couldn't prove it yet, but it was clear where the money was coming from. She was funneling the HOA's resources into her own lifestyle, all while disguising the scheme as enforcement of community standards. Daniel gathered everything he could find: copies of sale records, budgets, and testimony from former residents. He organized it into a growing file that painted a damning picture of corruption. The more evidence he collected, the more convinced he became that Karen had been operating unchecked for years, shielded by the perception that the HOA was simply doing its job. Most homeowners never questioned it, too afraid or too weary to fight back. That silence had given her free rein to exploit the system. But now, Karen had chosen the wrong target. Daniel refused to back down. Instead of quietly removing his shed and paying the fines, he reached out to a local investigative reporter, someone known for covering stories of fraud and abuse. He handed over his file, every document and lead he had uncovered. For the first time, the narrative began to shift. What had been a private battle between a homeowner and the HOA was starting to take on a much larger scope. As whispers spread that journalists were sniffing around Willow Creek, Karen's demeanor became even more hostile. Neighbors noticed her patrolling more often, snapping photos, and delivering violation letters with greater intensity. But Daniel no longer felt isolated. The truth was beginning to surface, and if he could push it far enough into the light, Karen's power might finally crack. He was no longer fighting for just his shed or his property. He was fighting to expose the corruption that had gripped Willow Creek for years. The pressure around Willow Creek built like a storm cloud ready to break. By the time the investigative reporter published the first article, the story spread quickly through the community. The piece exposed the suspicious home transfers, the inflated HOA fines, and the strange pattern of auctions that always benefited the same group of buyers. Names were named, and Karen stood boldly at the center. What had once been whispered, suspicions, was now laid out in print for the world to see. Daniel read the article 3 times in one sitting, a mix of relief and dread washing over him. The truth was finally public, but that also meant the battle had reached its most dangerous stage. The response from the neighborhood was immediate. Families who had once kept quiet began to talk. They shared stories of fines over mailbox colors, penalties for minor landscaping choices, and threats of foreclosure for missing payments by just a few days. Many admitted they had felt powerless and afraid to speak, but Daniel's persistence gave them the courage to come forward. What was once a silent, fearful community began shifting into something stronger, A collective of voices ready to stand against the woman who had ruled them through intimidation. Karen, however, did not back down quietly. She doubled her efforts, sending out stern letters dismissing the article as slander and claiming Daniel had fabricated the evidence. She tried to rally support from her loyal circle on the HOA board, but cracks had already formed. Some of the board members, realizing the truth was now out, began distancing themselves from her. What had once been blind loyalty began to look more like self-preservation. Karen's empire was weakening from within. When the first television crew arrived, the story exploded beyond the town. Reporters gathered outside Willow Creek, interviewing residents and shining cameras on the once pristine streets. The image of the perfect suburban neighborhood now carried a darker reputation, a place where power had been abused and homes had been stolen. Karen found herself surrounded not just by neighbors' suspicion but by the scrutiny of the public eye. For the first time, she seemed vulnerable. Legal authorities took notice too. Investigators launched an inquiry into the HOA's finances, and subpoenas followed quickly. Bank statements revealed that Karen had indeed been siphoning funds for personal use. Vacations, cars, and even luxury shopping trips were traced directly back to the association's budget. The so-called emergency bylaws she had passed were deemed illegal, exposing her manipulation of the system. Layer by layer, the careful web she had spun began to unravel. For Daniel, the court hearings became less about defending himself and more about providing testimony. He presented the documents he had uncovered, the interviews with former residents, and the financial inconsistencies. What had started as a desperate fight for his shed had transformed into a case that reached far beyond his property line. Each day in court revealed more of Karen's deception, and the once confident HOA president sat at the defendant's table, her posture shrinking as the evidence piled against her. The final judgment marked the collapse of her reign. Karen was found guilty of fraud and misuse of HOA funds, ordered to pay restitution, and stripped of her authority. The emergency bylaws were invalidated, the fines erased, and the homes wrongfully seized were flagged for review. For the families who had been forced out, it was a bittersweet victory. They could not all reclaim what they had lost, but at last their voices had been heard. In Willow Creek, the changes were immediate. A new board was elected, this time composed of residents who had lived through the ordeal and were determined to rebuild trust. The atmosphere shifted from fear to cautious optimism, as neighbors worked together to restore the sense of community they had once believed in. The streets looked the same as before, neatly trimmed lawns, children playing, porches decorated, but the shadow that had loomed over them was gone. For Daniel, the victory was personal but also transformative. He kept his home, but more importantly, he had exposed the truth and stopped a cycle that had ruined lives. He often thought back to that first letter, the one that had demanded the removal of his shed, and realized it had been the spark that lit the fire. What seemed like a trivial complaint had uncovered something vast and corrupt. He had entered the fight reluctantly, but in the end, he became the one who helped free his neighborhood from its grip. Willow Creek would never again be the flawless paradise it once appeared to be, but perhaps that was a good thing. Its perfection had been a mask, hiding something rotten beneath. Now, with the truth out in the open, the community could finally begin to heal. And as for Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of standards and order, her downfall stood as a reminder of how easily power can be twisted, and how dangerous it can become when no one dares to resist.